Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Jinnah Institute series of webinars. I'm Salman Zaidi. We are looking at an election season up ahead in 2023, and from the look of it, it's going to be a dirty contest. I say this because 2023 has been, the lead up to this year has been all about contested politics, strident extremisms, and within that, whenever we try to think about elections, we are forced to look back at the principles that become the casualty of any election season. In 2023, we are forced to ask ourselves what the question of minorities is. How can we accommodate the rights of minorities better in our political system? This opens up a host of questions on how political parties have written about minorities in their manifestos, what the promise has been, what negligence has there been on the part of political parties and our systems to accommodate their rights. Shall we only expect minorities to come forward and bear the burden of fuller citizenship? Or will our systems provide that support that they have taken upon themselves as a sacred trust? I'm very happy to have with us Mr. Peter Jacob and Saroop Ejaz, both eminent experts and human rights defenders. I'd like to start with Saroop Saab and ask what the state of elections is in Pakistan right now. And Saroop Saab, how do you see the accommodation or this legitimate space for minorities in this very contested, untidy domain?
Uh, I thank you for having me. Thank you to Jinnah Institute. Thank you to you for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this conversation. In terms of where we are at, I think in the larger scheme of things, we are at a point of unprecedented polarization. We are at a point both within Pakistan now, it seems, but also around the world and in the region where the idea of liberal democracy, at least, is under threat. And that has concerns, serious concerns for the architecture of democracy, for constitutionalism, for human rights. In terms of what that means for specifically for religious minorities in Pakistan, I think it points to a very worrying trend. What we've seen in the past few years, and now it's all seeing a high point of that, perhaps, is uh, exclusionary rhetoric. So polarization, like the one that we're seeing right now, comes with majoritarianism, which puts democracy or the idea of democracy, which protects everybody, at least in terms of an equality of citizenship, that is under threat in a way that is very worrying and perhaps unprecedented in recent history. Uh, with that, when we talk about political participation of religious minorities, I think political participation, much like everything else, cannot be viewed in a silo. What we have is social exclusion of minorities from the state structure, from the larger decision-making conversation, and that has a direct bearing on how minorities will participate, interact, engage with the political process, with the political system. Even if you look at the current political ruckus, the current disagreement, perhaps it seems a very amplified, violent disagreement within the political forces, within the state structure itself. Uh, Minorities are a bystander to this conversation. They're not part. They're not interlocutors. They're not part of this conversation, and that is a direct bearing on how political participation would happen in any state, but in a state like ours, where one can argue that the idea of equality of citizenship uh, has at least never been fully realized. And we've seen, I think this is a larger trend. You can probably trace it from the early 1980s, but we're seeing it now at an accelerated pace, where the entire political spectrum is moving towards moving right wing, moving towards a religious language, idiom way of doing politics. And that means that the space for minorities, it is limited as it is, both constitutionally or legally and practically, is threatened even more. One thing that you said in your introductory remarks about silos, about minorities having to bear the burden of speaking for themselves. Uh, I think we've seen that as well. And Peter Saab, of course, is here as part of this conversation, so he has far greater expertise and experience on the conversation on the electoral system and how that has evolved, joint and separate electorate debate. But what we have seen is when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about equality, is that minority members of parliament are often thought of being more suited or exclusively thought of being suited to a minorities portfolio. So it is not only at the societal level, it is also at the level of, as I can give you an example, if you look at the current legal conversation, uh, if you see somebody from a religious minority on Pakistani television, the chances are that that person is going to be talking about minority rights as opposed to about the economic situation, as opposed to about the constitutional conversation happening right now. So there is a much larger problem, which the context of it. But what we see right now is we are having a moment of majoritarianism, we are having a moment of right wing, we are having a moment of divisiveness, uh, and all that in a country which has the history that we have had, have proposes threats for social cohesion, for social inclusion, for social participation, for economic participation, and consequently, or perhaps more importantly, for all kinds of political participation. But I'll stop here.
Thank you for Saroop Saab for very insightful comments, especially about how minorities are not interlocutors in this larger political system, but mere bystanders to the mad political show that goes on. Peter Saab, you have worked for many, many years. Your institution has produced very fine reports on political party manifestos, recommendations for how uh, constituency profiles, seat nominations can improve. If you can reflect a little bit on the numbers that Saroop Saab has the issues that he has referenced, how are minorities continuing to be bystanders to the larger parliamentary process, the larger electioneering process, as well as how, when they come into positions of power or authority, they are constantly having to bear the burden of minority issues when they could speak to many other strengths?
Well, thank you so much, Salman and Jinnah Institute, for inviting me to speak on this very important subject around this time. Uh, so we are basically working with a time bracket of 10 years. So 2013 onwards, we are looking at the quality question of minority representation and participation. We can use two parameters. Either we look at, subjectively, what has happened in these 10 years, how many bills were tabled, how many were passed, and what were the events that characterize basically the parliamentary participatory democracy. So we can generally agree with the Saroop Ejaz assertions that the quality of democracy and quality of participatory democracy has gone down. And that has impacted minority representation too. In the meantime, uh, using the first parameter of looking at events, we can identify that there was in 2019 there was a bill tabled about the regulating Christian marriages and divorce acts, which was not even tabled. It was passed by the cabinet, but because certain flaws were found, it was withheld. We see that the bill with regards to formation of National Commission for Minorities' Rights has been tabled recently after a considerable delay, uh, and it is not yet passed. So what we see is that Hindu Marriages Act has not been considered to, also adopt the rules of procedures, which lies redundant after, say, 10 years of its passage. We also see that we were encouraged to see that the government had set up a parliamentary committee on forced conversions, prevention of forced conversions, which worked for 2 years. But sadly, when the bill was tabled in the committee itself, it refused to consider it in 2021. The committee was disbanded and it refused to consider the bill. And the opposition came from certain religious parties, but also religious elements from the ruling party who objected to the very idea of, they were not ready to accept and acknowledge the issue. So two minority members, they have taken floor, basically not for legislation but something else. One was a reaction to a seminar organized by one of the ministries, Ministry for Religious Affairs, which had somehow tried to push the denial about the existence of forced conversions. So one of the senators, Senator Kamran Michael, he took the floor, he moved a resolution, and then staged a walk out. That was also a sad occasion. So, second time, Mr. Ahmed Naveed Jiva has to take the floor to basically raise objection to a speech made by a member belonging to a religious party who made certain remarks about the gospel and Bible, which were not agreeable, desirable at all. So that was an occasion. Luckily, he took a very soft tone in his speech and he raised this. If you look at those events, I think the question of we would agree with the observations made by Mr. Saroop Ejaz that one, the members, excuse me, the members belonging to religious minorities are forced to self-plead, and they are forced to contain themselves to minorities issues. Second, that when the issues are tabled and the bills are tabled, they are not given due consideration and no debates take place, so that legislative business is suffering a serious touch. But coming back to the scheme of representation that exists, I think first of all we have to acknowledge that this is a scheme that has been forced on us by the circumstances. One, demography. If you look at demography, the minorities have shrunk so much, at least what the data says, the data prepared by Bureau of Statistics, National Census, because of negligence, there are signs in even the ongoing census that minorities are being neglected and the proper count is not being done. So the demography, which is a huge imbalance, is also an imposition, a hurdle, a challenge with regard to their participation. Then they are spread out. The concentration of minorities, it may be a blessing or not, but when it happens, like in Tharparkar, for instance, it is very difficult to get minority representation. So we have to live with this reserved seats, which is a kind of structural participation, trying to ensure the structural participation of minorities, and it is based on affirmative action. So this far, I think the scheme is good. Basically, reserved seats, and now that participation has increased considerably as compared to separate electorate, and this must be given due chance, due recognition. Something that we can do with regards to improving the quality of representation, I think if the parties can emphasize on internal democracy, if the parties have elections and therein they prepare lists for reserve seats, which are called priority lists given to the election commission for their selection as per proportion of success in the respective assemblies. That list should be prepared using that internal democratic process. I mean to suggest that there should be internal intra-party elections to fill those reserve seats, which which I think can contribute to more participation, confidence building within the party, and consolidating the position of their representation if they are joining the house with the broad backing of electorate within the party. Rest, uh, there are problems with regards to narrative that state has adopted over the time. As you recalled in your narrative, in the beginning of this webinar, the state has relied on the narrative of sacred minorities or sacred trust. I don't think there is need for any sanctification or any reverence to be shown if their rights were equal and if their rights were acknowledged and realized. So I think even more dangerous is the trend that sometimes when we take up a stand, we forget our minorities. For instance, Pakistan's government has been focusing on the narrative of Islamophobia in the United Nations and other places without considering how it will impact the position of minorities and whether it will strengthen the opposite forces here. I mean, there are groups who openly preach hatred against minorities, and my worry is that by adopting a singular religion narrative outside, we also strengthen the view that somehow the internal situation is either in the best of circumstances and we don't have to worry about ourselves, just the rest of the world, and or it is the assumption that somehow we are taking care of the international affairs better than any other international multilateral body. So I think there is a lot that we need to think about the mega narrative that the state has adopted. That has to be inclusive. That has to be religiously inclusive and neutral so that it doesn't make any preference and exclusion of any community that becomes a problem for our internal governance and issues with regard to. For instance, I was considering if our Ministry of Foreign Affairs had to speak to the government, so-called government in Afghanistan, I mean, whatever government it is, how would they argue non-discrimination on the basis of gender and religion when they take exclusive narratives to international forums? So I think there's a lot that we need to do in the policy areas, not just the implementation. That's why it is question of the central narrative which will form and the respect that is shown to human rights in general rather than just the minorities' rights and in one sector, and that is political representation.
Thank you for that, Peter Saab. I think we're completely agreed on the idea that the state's narrative, especially the usage of terms like sacred trust, are exclusionary. They serve to further, wedge the sort of distance between communities, and also, I think sacred trust might have led to a romanticization of the idea that we're perhaps making good on the ideas of the republic, but how that bears out in reality is a very different story. Very good, useful observations made there. Saroop Saab, at the risk of asking a bit of a basic question, why is any of this important? If so exclusion of minorities has been a practice that we've seen both at the parliamentary level, in our politics, as well as other institutions. What is the disadvantage of making this republic so exclusive as we have already made it?
No, I think it is a basic question in the sense that it is the fundamental question. It is the normative idea of why do we need to be tolerant. I think there are multiple levels of this. There's the level of principle, of course, of why there is moral imperative to be tolerant. There's a moral imperative to be non-discriminatory. There's a historical imperative, but now also there is a functional argument. There is to be for us to be a modern progressive country. That's it's essentially you. If you don't, you're not a modern progressive democracy. You countries such as ours, there can be different models which might work for some other countries. Very few examples. Uh, make themselves uncompetitive. They make their credibility at the international stage uh, completely impeach their credibility. But most importantly, I think, is the domestic argument, which is the lesson of our history and perhaps the history of the world, is that islands of persecution don't work. We've seen one of the most violent conflicts that we've seen in this country, the existential threats to this country, don't come from people or forces like the TTP who seek to attack religious minorities. They seek to attack what they think is a minority. They seek to attack. So then where does this end? And so what islands of persecutions, island of exclusion, it's not only normatively wrong. No state can function. It is simply that no state can function. And that is the lesson that we have sadly not learned, which is ceding space to exclusionary forces uh, means that you'll have to cede more space, and then you'll have to cede more space. And this escalation ladder ends with you backed up against a wall or with no more space to cede. So be it the conflict between from the 90s or the 80s from Shia and Sunni, that wasn't good enough. Now between the Deobandis and Barelvis. And when all of that happens, of course, religious minorities in Pakistan are disproportionately affected. Whenever we say that, most victims of religious violence in Pakistan are Muslims, that makes a symbolic point, but it does not make a practical point, which is that 98.6% of Pakistan is Muslim. So, but why all of this is important is essentially this is where a society or a government which becomes partisan in towards its citizens on the basis of their faith, on the basis of their identity, will have to become increasingly partisan towards more and more of its citizens. When you talk about political participation, when you talk about inclusion, when you talk about giving a seat at the table at the national conversation, uh, it means political parties, it means political forces aligning themselves, giving the seat at the table within those parties. I think one important dimension of it is that there is a top-down model of it. Of course, we've seen, and I think there's great value to reserved seats. I think symbolic value. There's a great practical value. There's a great legislative value. But it also has to start on the other end of the spectrum from bottom up, where you need to have, let's say, functional local governments, where parties will give tickets. But I think part of it is it's also a reflection on what our democracy is and how our democracy has to be more inclusive, be more participatory, be more modern, and be more grassroots, because there is the level of the National Assembly and the level of the Senate, but there is also the level of the village council, of the level of the union council, and for a political participation of minority conversation has to, of course, encompass both ends of the spectrum. But I think uh, without uh, having parties give electoral tickets to people from different faiths, which is, and giving this symbolic message that the party aligns with this person, the party aligns its political capital with this person, uh, both at the level of the Union Council, at the level of the Provincial Assembly, at the level of the National Assembly, and at the level of the Cabinet, is very important.
Saroop Sahib, if you could also briefly comment on the state of media and how we need to message for minorities during these elections, or positively about democracy during these elections. If you take a minute or two also to address that.
Uh, of course, I think media plays a very important part in enabling this national conversation that we've talked about, which democracy essentially is. It is a national conversation. Uh, I think part of it, there's two or three levels of where the media in Pakistan can do better. Again, with shining examples, exceptions is one is the obvious one, which is representation. As I said, minority people from different faiths, people from religious minorities, are invited to speak about issues of religious minorities. They are not invited to speak about everything else. They're not invited to speak about economy or foreign policy or law or agriculture. Uh, and the question is not that there are no experts or viable experts. So there is the question of representation, but there's also the question of the framing of it. And what Peter have, I think, hinted at, there is the framing of the paternal state, of the state owing a responsibility to minorities, and what that needs to change is it has to be replaced by the language of equal citizenship. How the media frames it, I think, and then there is at the other end of the spectrum, I think there is a far more dangerous trend, which is, again, I will say this, not for all, even most of the media, but we have seen the enabling of exclusion. We've seen incitement of hate. We've seen incitement of violence. Uh, there are laws in place for that, but more importantly, there has to be the media uh, has to regulate itself. So both at the level of representation, at the level of how issues are framed, and at the level of discharging the responsibility of doing no harm. I think we have this expectation, a legitimate, everyone in Pakistan should have this expectation from the media, particularly, as you said, as we lead up to what seems to be a very dangerous confrontation, both at the level of society and at the level of politics.
Thank you, Saroop Saab. Peter Jacob Saab, it's over to you for the final question. What outcomes would you like to see as part of this election for minorities? What is a successful benchmark for you in terms of representation, in terms of quality of participation, as well as the larger outlook of our democracy?
Well, we are poised to go to general election this year sometime. October is the most heard about month that the elections will take place. I think what I would like to see is a reduced interference of non-political actors in every respect. I think if the politics is allowed to grow as a normal political process, that would entail to a better representation, houses, and perhaps discourse and processes. This is not limited to the overall political culture and the quality of house, but also minorities. But because we have seen the minority representative being harassed, being used to change political equations, to bring someone in power or dislodge. That is a practice that should not be happening. That should not be happening while the nominations, because this is a stage where nominations will matter, and more serious elements, aspirants and desirable candidates will join if that kind of pressure is not there. So while several experiments have been carried out, I also see this interference of the non-political forces in the political process as something that we can improve upon drastically. That's one leverage that we have.
Thank you, Peter Saab. In any evaluation of an election, I think it's important to see what did not turn out or did not turn out as an outcome, a desirable outcome. I think in any assessment, it is also important to see what principles have come into more emphasis and what we have learned as a result of an election cycle. It is important to take longer term views of Pakistan's politics to really understand where minorities stand. As this discussion has highlighted, there have been islands of exclusion, and perhaps these may continue for some time. In our search for a more egalitarian participatory politics and for greater space for minorities, we hope that there is greater representation, greater constituency accommodation, as well as better reform within parties. With that, I'd like to thank our experts, Peter Jacob Saab and Saroop Ejaz Saab, for joining us, and we hope to have you with us another time. Thank you.